Imagine waking up thousands of years ago. There is no phone in your pocket, no Google Maps, no road signs, no GPS telling you that you're 12 minutes from home. And the worst part? You don't even know exactly where you are. You're standing in a forest you've never seen before. The sun is disappearing. Every direction looks almost identical. Behind you is a path you think you came from. In front of you is a landscape you've never explored. And somewhere out there is your family. Maybe they're waiting for you. Maybe they aren't. Today, if you get lost, you can make one decision and solve the entire problem. You stop. You pull out your phone. You find your location. But thousands of years ago, that little rectangle didn't exist. There wasn't even a map waiting to tell you where you were. So what did you do? Did ancient humans simply wander around until they found their way home? Or did they have a way of navigating that was far more sophisticated than we imagine? Because here's the strange part. Some ancient people traveled hundreds, even thousands of kilometers across landscapes they'd never seen before, and somehow came back. So how did they know where they were going? And more importantly, what happened when they got it wrong? The first thing you have to understand is that being lost meant something very different to an ancient human. Today, being lost usually means one thing. You don't know where you are. But ancient humans didn't think about location the way we do. They didn't need to know their exact coordinates. They needed to know something much simpler. How do I get to the next place? That distinction changes everything. Because imagine you're walking through a forest. You don't know the name of the forest. You don't know its coordinates. You don't have a map. But you remember that somewhere ahead there is a river, and beyond that river is a hill, and behind that hill is the place where your people live. You don't need to know where you are on a map. You just need to recognize the world around you. And humans became extraordinarily good at doing exactly that. But there was a problem. The landscape doesn't always cooperate. Trees can hide familiar landmarks. Fog can erase mountains. Snow can bury trails. A storm can destroy tracks. And darkness can make a familiar landscape completely unrecognizable. So what happens when the landmarks disappear? That is where the real mystery begins. The world was their map. Take a modern human and drop them somewhere unfamiliar. Most people immediately look for signs. A road, a building, a street name, a familiar landmark, something artificial. Ancient humans had almost none of those things. Their map was the environment itself. A particular mountain, a bend in a river, a strange rock formation, a valley, a coastline, a group of trees. Even the direction of the wind could matter. And these weren't just random details. They could become mental landmarks. Imagine walking the same route dozens of times. At first, it looks like nothing but wilderness. Eventually, you notice something. A large stone beside the trail. A tree split into two trunks. A hill shaped differently from the others. A river that always makes the same turn. You remember them. Then the next time you travel, you look for them. And suddenly, the wilderness isn't wilderness anymore. It's a sequence. Stone, river, hill, forest, valley, home. Ancient humans didn't necessarily need a physical map because they carried maps inside their heads. But this raises another question. What if you were traveling somewhere you'd never been before? What if there were no familiar landmarks at all? Then humans needed something else. Something much farther away. Something that never moved. For thousands of years, humans have looked at the sky for more than weather. They looked for direction. The sun was the obvious starting point. It rises in one general direction. It sets in the opposite direction. That alone gives you something incredibly valuable, a reference. If you know roughly which way you've been traveling, the movement of the sun can help you maintain your orientation. But the sun has a weakness. It disappears. And once darkness arrives, the world becomes much harder to read, unless you know where to look. Up. The night sky doesn't look like a map to us, but to people who depended on it, it could become one. Certain stars appear in predictable parts of the sky. Some rise, some set, some remain visible for long periods. And in the northern hemisphere, the stars around the celestial North Pole appear to rotate around a relatively fixed point. That meant the sky could provide something the forest couldn't: consistency. Trees fall, rivers change, trails disappear, but the stars keep appearing, and humans learn to recognize them. This became especially powerful for people who traveled across open landscapes, and nowhere was this more important than the sea. Because imagine getting lost on land. You can still walk, you can climb a hill, you can follow a river, you can search for footprints. Now imagine getting lost in the middle of an ocean. There are no trees, no roads, no mountains. Sometimes there isn't even land visible in any direction. One wrong turn can become catastrophic. Yet ancient seafaring peoples crossed enormous stretches of ocean, and some of them navigated using combinations of stars, the sun, winds, currents, waves, birds, and knowledge passed between generations. The ocean looked empty. It wasn't. To an experienced navigator, it was full of clues, but there was another problem. What happens when the sky disappears too? Imagine you're traveling through unfamiliar territory. Then the fog arrives, the mountain disappears, the sun disappears, the horizon disappears. Suddenly, your most reliable landmarks are gone. This is where navigation becomes less about knowing where you are and more about remembering what happened before. Ancient travelers could rely on routes, not roads in the modern sense, routes, a sequence of places. You go toward the river, follow it until it bends, then leave the river, find the valley, cross the ridge, look for the distinctive rock, continue from there. It's almost like following invisible instructions stored in your memory, and these instructions could become incredibly detailed. People living in the same landscape for generations could develop intimate knowledge of it. They knew where water could be found, where animals traveled, where certain plants grew, where snow lasted longest, which paths became dangerous after rain, which valleys were easier to cross, which mountains could be seen from particular locations. The landscape became a kind of information network. But there was something even more important. Ancient humans didn't always travel alone, and that changes the entire equation. You didn't have to remember everything. Imagine you're part of a small community. One person knows where the water is, another knows the safest route through the mountains, someone else knows where animals migrate, another person remembers a distant settlement. No single person knows everything, but together, the group does. This is one of the most powerful survival tools humans ever developed. Knowledge could be shared. A route could become a story. A dangerous mountain could become a warning. A river crossing could become part of a tradition. A distant location could be remembered through landmarks and descriptions. And when children grew up, they didn't start from zero. They inherited the mental map of everyone who came before them. This meant that humans could travel farther than any individual person's experience should have allowed. But what about the person who actually got separated? Because eventually, someone would. A hunter, a traveler, a child, a scout, someone following an animal, someone caught in a storm, someone who simply took the wrong turn. And when that happened, the first instinct may not have been to keep walking. It may have been to do something surprisingly modern. Stop. The worst thing you can do when lost. Today, survival experts often warn against making the situation worse by moving randomly. The same basic logic would have applied thousands of years ago. If you don't know where you are, walking farther doesn't necessarily make things better. It can make the mystery bigger. You leave the last place you recognize, then you leave the next place. Now you're not just lost. You're lost somewhere else. So an experienced traveler might instead try to reconstruct the mistake. Where was the last familiar landmark? Which direction were you traveling? How long had you been walking? What terrain had you crossed? Was the sun on one side of you? Was the river flowing in a particular direction? Were there tracks? Could you retrace your route? This is where human memory becomes a survival tool. But memory has a weakness: fear. When you're calm, the forest has information. When you're terrified, every tree looks identical. Every sound feels threatening. And every direction starts to look like the right direction. That could turn a simple mistake into a disaster. So ancient humans had another advantage. They learned not only how to navigate, but how to recognize when navigation was becoming dangerous. The animal clue. Now imagine you're traveling through unfamiliar wilderness. You don't recognize the landscape, but something else does. Animals, birds, insects, predators. Even the behavior of local wildlife can reveal information. A flock of birds moving in a particular direction could suggest water or land. Animal tracks could reveal that you're near a river or a known route. A concentration of wildlife might indicate a reliable water source. Some animals repeatedly travel along the same paths, and humans could learn to recognize those patterns. But there is an even stranger possibility. What if the animal itself became the guide? Humans have followed animals for food for an unimaginably long time. And following prey doesn't just teach you where the animal is. It teaches you how the landscape works, where animals gather, where they cross rivers, where they shelter, where they move seasonally. Over generations, this becomes knowledge, and knowledge becomes culture. A group that understands its environment has a huge advantage over a group that doesn't. But there was one clue that humans could see even when the landscape was unfamiliar. Something coming from the ground. Follow the water. If you're lost in many environments, water is one of the most valuable things you can find. But ancient humans didn't just need water to drink. Water also changes the landscape. Rivers create valleys. They connect regions. They attract animals. They can provide routes through difficult terrain. And they can lead toward other settlements. So, if you don't know where you are, finding a river might not just solve your thirst, it might solve the entire navigation problem. You can follow it. You can search for crossings. You can look for signs of human activity. And sometimes, a river eventually leads you somewhere people live. But rivers can also deceive you. A river doesn't need necessarily lead home. It might take you deeper into unknown territory. So humans needed to understand not just individual landmarks, but how the entire landscape connected. And that's when something extraordinary happened. Humans began turning geography into memory. The first mental maps. Imagine a child growing up in a landscape. They learn the route from the shelter to the river, then from the river to the hunting grounds, then from the hunting grounds to another valley. They learn where the sun appears during different seasons. They learn which mountain is visible from which direction. They learn which paths are safe. Eventually, they can picture the landscape without standing in it. That's a mental map. And humans are exceptionally good at creating them. You probably use one without realizing it. You know roughly where your home is compared with your workplace. You know which roads connect. You know where a certain store is, even if you don't know its coordinates. You don't need to calculate latitude and longitude. Your brain stores relationships. This is close to that. This is beyond that. If I pass this hill, I should eventually reach the river. Ancient humans were doing the same thing. The difference is that their survival could depend on how accurate that mental map was. And some people became exceptionally skilled at it. So skilled that they could navigate landscapes that would leave an untrained person completely helpless. But there is one environment where this becomes truly unbelievable: the open ocean. When there is nothing to see. Imagine standing on a beach. You look toward the horizon. Nothing. You travel farther. Still nothing. The coastline disappears. Now you're surrounded by water. If you're hundreds of kilometers from home, how do you know which direction to go? You can't simply look for your house. You can't climb a hill. You can't follow a road. And the waves don't come with signs. Yet ancient maritime cultures developed ways to navigate enormous distances. They observed the sun. They observed stars. They learned prevailing winds. They recognized currents. They paid attention to waves. They observed birds. They remembered the positions of islands. They understood seasonal changes, and they passed this knowledge down. The ocean became readable. Not easy, not safe, but readable. And that tells us something important. Humans didn't overcome the problem of navigation by inventing one magical device. They did it by collecting thousands of tiny clues. One clue alone might mean nothing, but together, they could point home. The danger of being wrong. There's something we don't think about when using GPS. Being wrong is cheap. If you miss a turn, your phone simply recalculates. Ancient humans didn't have that luxury. A wrong turn could cost hours. A wrong route could cost days. And in extreme environments, it could cost your life. Imagine crossing a dry landscape. You believe water is ahead, but you misremembered the route. Now you're walking farther away from it. Every step makes the original mistake harder to fix. Or imagine traveling through a mountain range. You choose the wrong valley. The terrain becomes steeper. The weather changes. Night approaches. You now have another problem. You need shelter. And suddenly, navigation isn't just about getting home. It's about surviving until you can find your way home. This is why ancient navigation wasn't simply a clever skill. It was part of survival itself. And sometimes, the best navigational decision wasn't knowing where to go. It was knowing where not to go. The landmark that wasn't there. Here's something strange. A landmark doesn't have to be physically permanent to be useful. Imagine a tree that stands beside a trail for generations. Everyone knows it. People use it to navigate. Then one day, it falls. Suddenly, the landscape changes. The mental map and the real landscape no longer match. This is one of the hidden problems of ancient navigation. The world changes. Rivers move, forests grow, trails disappear, coastlines shift, animals change their routes, storms destroy landmarks, snow covers everything. And yet humans still have to navigate. So they couldn't rely on a single clue. They needed redundancy. If the tree is gone, use the hill. If the hill is hidden, use the river. If the river is inaccessible, use the stars. If the stars disappear, use memory. If memory fails, then maybe you stop and wait. That ability to switch between different systems may have been one of humanity's greatest navigational advantages, and it leads to a much bigger discovery. Humans weren't simply finding their way through nature. They were learning to read nature. To a modern person, a forest can look like a wall of trees. To someone who grew up there, it can contain hundreds of clues. The moss, the slope, the shape of the hills, the direction of water, the location of animal tracks, the position of the sun, the smell of vegetation, the sound of flowing water, the presence or absence of birds, even the texture of the ground. None of these things is a GPS coordinate, but together they can tell you where you are. This is why saying ancient humans simply wandered around misses the point. They weren't necessarily navigating a blank world. They were navigating an environment filled with information. We just don't notice most of it anymore. Modern technology has hidden many of the clues our ancestors were forced to pay attention to. We don't need to know which direction we're facing. Our phone does. We don't need to remember every turn. Our phone does. We don't need to memorize the landscape. Our phone does. And that creates a strange thought. What if you lost your phone tomorrow? How much of your environment could you actually read? There was another secret to ancient navigation. Not everyone needed to know everything. Certain people became specialists, hunters, traders, explorers, sailors, scouts, travelers. Their knowledge could become incredibly valuable. A person who knew how to cross a difficult region could possess information that others desperately needed, and that knowledge could be taught, generation after generation. Some cultures developed sophisticated oral traditions for remembering places, routes, stars, winds, and landscapes. Stories weren't always just entertainment. Sometimes a story was a map disguised as a story. A route could be remembered through a sequence of landmarks. A dangerous place could be attached to a warning. A distant location could be connected to a memorable event. This made information easier to remember. And that matters because before widespread writing, memory was one of humanity's greatest storage systems. The brain was the database, Stories were the files. Experienced travelers were the living maps. And losing one of those people could mean losing information that had taken generations to accumulate. But humans eventually found another way to make navigation easier. They began leaving clues behind. At some point, humans stopped merely reading the landscape. They started modifying it. Trails became clearer. Paths became established. Markers could identify routes. Settlements became recognizable. Structures could act as landmarks. Roads eventually connected distant communities. And now, something revolutionary had happened. You no longer had to rely entirely on nature. Humans were building their own navigation system. Imagine traveling through an unfamiliar region and suddenly finding a road. You don't know exactly where it leads, but you know something important. Other humans have been here. Follow it long enough, and it might lead somewhere. A settlement, a trading route, a river crossing, another road. Eventually, these paths became networks, and those networks transformed human civilization. Because once people could move more reliably, goods could move, ideas could move, languages could move, technology could move, people could move. The ability to find your way wasn't just about getting home anymore. It was helping create the world. So what happened when they really got lost? The uncomfortable answer is, sometimes they didn't make it back. Not every mystery had a clever solution. Not every traveler found the river. Not every hunter recognized the right mountain. Not every sailor returned. Ancient people were extraordinarily capable, but they weren't superhuman. The wilderness was still dangerous. A storm could erase a trail. A mountain could become impossible to cross. An injury could make movement nearly impossible. A lack of water could turn a navigational mistake into a fatal one. And sometimes, getting lost was simply the beginning of the end. That makes the skill of navigation even more impressive, because every successful journey represented a problem solved. Someone left, someone found their way, and someone came home. Again, and again, and again, until the knowledge became tradition. The strange thing about modern humans. Now think about what happens when you get lost today. You might panic for a second. Then you reach into your pocket. You look at a screen. A blue dot appears. And suddenly, the mystery disappears. You know where you are. You know where you're going. You know how long it will take. You know which direction to walk. It's almost magical. But that convenience hides something. For most of human history, there was no blue dot. There was only the landscape. And humans had to become incredibly good at interpreting it. They learned the stars. They learned the sun. They learned rivers. They learned mountains. They learned animals. They learned weather. They learned memory. They learned from one another. And eventually, they built roads, maps, compasses, and navigation instruments on top of all that accumulated knowledge. The technology changed, but the original problem never did. A human being still wants to know one simple thing. Where am I? We often think of modern navigation as something technology gave us, but technology didn't create our desire to know where we are. It only gave us a faster answer. Long before maps, humans were already making mental maps. Long before compasses, they were reading the sun. Long before GPS, they were looking at stars. Long before road signs, they were remembering landmarks. And long before someone could simply type an address into a phone, a human being was standing somewhere in the wilderness, looking around, asking the exact same question we still ask today. How do I get home? The difference is that when ancient humans looked around, they couldn't ask a machine. They had to ask the world. And somehow, the world answered. The next time you get lost, imagine what that moment would have felt like thousands of years ago. No signal, no map, no voice telling you to turn left. Just you, the landscape, and the fading light. And yet, for thousands of generations, humans learned to look at that same wilderness and see something we can barely see anymore. A direction, a path, a river, a landmark, a way home. Maybe ancient humans weren't less advanced because they had no GPS. Maybe they were simply forced to become the GPS themselves.